Hello, bosses, and welcome to today's Power Lunch webinar. I'm Aries, the founder and CEO of Bossed Up, and this Power Lunch webinar is part of our Fierce Fall Challenge, the 10-week challenge that we've all been a part of, a lot of us have been a part of, since September, leading into Thanksgiving, which is now less than 2 weeks away. And these past 10 weeks have been really exciting. We've all been striving and thriving on the road to achieving our final biggest goal between now and Thanksgiving. So whether that's leveling up in your career in some way or making more time to develop a skill or pick up a new hobby, it's been so amazing to see how many people have taken part in this challenge, our annual event here at Bossed Up. So thank you to those of you who've been a part of it. If you have, share your Fierce Fall goal, or even if you're just coming up with one goal that you want to achieve, to make the most of the rest of 2015 before the holidays totally consume us, feel free to start weighing in that chat bar right now. Tell us your name, where you're from, and what brought you to today's conversation, or what is your Fierce Fall goal. And for those of you who want to learn more, that's still available. You can get lots of resources by heading over to bossedup.org/fiercefall to get in on the challenge. Today, we're sitting down with Ilyse Hogue, the president of NARAL, who was just named by Washingtonian magazine as one of the most powerful women in Washington. She's a fierce advocate and an absolute inspiration, and it's my pleasure to have her joining us here today to talk a little bit about what we would talk about over lunch, sort of how you got to where you are today, and what lessons that we in the Bossed Up community can glean from your journey thus far. So thank you so much for joining us, Ilyse.
Thanks for having me. I'm psyched to be here.
Awesome. So first, I want to congratulate you on your twins, which are a recent arrival in your life, and welcome back from maternity leave. I know you've been back at it for a little while now, but congratulations on all of those exciting endeavors. As the president of NARAL, I was going to ask, sort of, what does that mean to you to have that ability to take some time out, even in this executive leadership position that you're in? And what does that say about, you know, what paid parental leave might mean for the rest of us too?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, my twins are 5 months old now, and I took about 10 weeks out of the office. NARAL actually gives a full 3 months paid, which puts us among just about 12% of places in the United States where you get that length of time. And I was, I was deeply grateful for it. Of course, I'm the boss, but I inherited that policy.
Right.
I didn't have to change it. But, I had a bunch of different thoughts about it. First off, when the 2-week mark hit, after I had had the babies, and I recognize that's when most women in this country are going back to work, I felt viscerally what I've known intellectually for a long time, which is that our country's policies around this are absolutely insane, right? Your body is not healed after 2 weeks. That is the time when you need to focus on you and your family. And that's not, I think the way that it gets framed too often in the United States is, oh, that's because we're selfish or we're fragile and we need that time. But what we really know from looking around the world is that is because it creates better outcomes, not just for the family, but for society as a whole, when we have that opportunity. And one of the things that we know is that when companies or organizations like mine do it voluntarily, we do it because we believe in it. We do it because it's important. And we do it because I do believe there's some benefit to us individually as an organization in terms of retention of talent, getting people back when they're ready to come back. But we are actually at a disadvantage because our culture as a whole has not actually offered these benefits. So, we take a hit when our competitors in the marketplace aren't taking the same hit. And so for us to actually really be able to reap the benefits as a country, we have to have a level playing field on this. And so that is why, since I've been at NARAL, we've expanded our definition of what it means to advocate for reproductive rights, and parental leave is a very, very big part of that.
Awesome. And it's funny, I'm always reminded of what an anomaly the United States is in the broader scheme of things, right? We are sort of an outlier in how we treat new parents in the workplace. And not that I'm a parent, so I can't speak from personal experience, but I know that as someone in my late 20s, and for a lot of us bosses in the Bossed Up community who want to take charge of our lives, want to be the advocates for ourselves that we can be, it's about sort of predicting or trying to plan this huge part of our identity, this huge part of our lives someday with an uncertain workplace or uncertain sort of economy. It can just be really uncertain for both the employer and the employee, when in every other industrialized nation, they've sort of made those big sweeping policy decisions collectively. So tell us more about your work at NARAL, Ilyse. So you've had a really fascinating career in that you have started in environmental justice and sort of that movement. You've made your way to DC as a part of MoveOn.org, and then you've leapt over to what is relatively a different issue area. Some might call it a career change, but it's really under the umbrella of advocacy. But I read somewhere that you said I wasn't necessarily a card-carrying member of a feminist organization. And then you stepped up to be this sort of president of NARAL. How did that happen, and what did you learn in making those shifts throughout your career?
It's a great question, Emily, and it was organic. It was not planned. In many ways, what appears to be nonlinear from the outside perspective makes perfect sense to me. I mean, I think a couple of fluid things happen. One is that at every step along the way, I saw the preeminent role that women played in achieving social justice outcomes. And, as you said, I started in environment and human rights, but I didn't start actually with governmental advocacy. I did a lot of corporate advocacy and saying corporations needed to change their behavior in order for us to live in a sustainable world and afford the human rights that we know are necessary. And what I found is when there were women present at the table, and that went everywhere from the communities that we were working with on the ground in Indonesia or Africa to the boardrooms at Citigroup or Bank of America, that we had better outcomes, right? That we were able to actually have difficult conversations, but work towards solutions. And that was really interesting to me. And then I went to MoveOn because I did want to get more involved in understanding political advocacy and civic engagement. And what I found is that we had our super volunteers were often women. And women were lead spokespeople in all of their communities, MoveOn being an entirely volunteer-driven organization. And so I was like, this is really interesting. I see an emerging pattern here. Right. And then what really was the tipping point for me was in 2012 when we had a lot of candidates saying things that we see now as crazy, or we saw at the time as crazy, like legitimate rape shuts pregnancy down, that what we were really fighting against was a unbelievably antiquated worldview, and that there was a lot of opportunity there if we were willing to think innovatively and creatively about what it meant to support women's leadership in the 21st century. And so many of the organizations doing that work are what I call legacy organizations, like mine, that were founded in second wave feminism, that played an incredible role in building the foundation. I always remind people, when NARAL was founded, women couldn't get credit cards on their own without their husbands signing off on it. Isn't that crazy? And so actually, I didn't seek NARAL out. NARAL sought me out when they were looking for a new president. And I thought, well, that's crazy. I don't have any experience in reproductive rights. But then I thought about the cumulative experience I had saying, when women can fully participate in the conversation, we have better outcomes, right? And when we have, and that goes from like corporate outcomes, bottom line, to actual social justice outcomes. And that there is no better way to assure women's participation than to assure that we have decision-making power over our own lives. And that all comes down to our ability to be mindful and plan our families and know that we're going to have the support when we're trying not to get pregnant, if we face an unintended pregnancy, and then when we transition into being parents. And I think that's the real difference between what I call the emerging feminism and the second wave feminism, on whose shoulders we stand, is that women now fully expect to be in the workplace for their entire reproductive lives, right? Which means reproductive freedom means a lot of different things. And we needed to tell a new story and bring a new vision to bear. And, you know, part of what we do talk about is access to contraception and access to abortion, and also pregnancy discrimination and parental leave, so that we're supported through our entire lifetimes, because it's not just about us, it's about our families. And as most of your viewers know, in the modern America, even married couples are dependent on two incomes to get by. And so being able to plan your family and be protected when you are giving birth is instrumental to our economic security. And so it's just been a real joy to sort of take the helm of this legacy organization, think about the ways to expand and redefine the conversation at a time where I think feminism is having a resurgence writ large. And being a part of that conversation has been awesome.
Fantastic. You took the word out of my mouth. I was just like, awesome. You're preaching my language, and it sounds super familiar, because when I started off as an organizer myself. I was a young whippersnapper state director, helping to pass health reform when Organizing for America came about after President Obama was elected. And all of my volunteer leadership was women, right? These were women who wanted to have a big impact in their communities, and the training and resources that were provided made some of those women volunteers into future women candidates and then future women campaign managers. So it was just an amazing sort of evolution to see. And it was absolutely the spark that got Bossed Up started in my head as a vehicle through which we can provide training to advance women's careers in a sustainable way, writ large, right? In a more broad and sweeping way. I want to take a moment here to encourage you to ask your questions in the chat bar right now. So what questions do you have for Ilyse? Is it about her career? Is it about NARAL? Is it about what we just talked about the role of parental leave? How do these sort of issues manifest in your life right now? What is it that you're either concerned about or anxious about, or just being thoughtful and planning when thinking about the future of your career? Go ahead and type that into the chat bar right now, and we'll make sure to save them for the end of our conversation. Now, Ilyse, I wanted to ask you about where men fit into this picture, because when you talk about pregnancy discrimination and we talk about the need for parental leave policy, I also think about the hit that men take when it comes to actually using parental leave, when it's even available to them, which is sort of rare. But there has been shown to be like a stigma that men have to contend with when actually trying to show up as full parents. And yet there's been some research that shows that they seem to get a more financial bonus in terms of, as a father, he probably needs more salary, whereas women face the opposite relationship with our salaries when we become parents. So what does that look like in your neck of the woods? If I may, I'm a big fan of your husband, John Neffinger, who is the author of Compelling People, who is a president of his own organization, who has his own business, who is an adjunct professor at Columbia Business School, right? And so it's not like any of us high-achieving women necessarily have that sort of stay-at-home wife type persona built into our family unit. And especially in your case with two executive rock star parents, how does that sort of play out at home? You can take that in any direction you want, because I covered a lot of ground there.
I'm incredibly lucky to have a remarkably supportive partner, husband, who believes that the work that I'm doing in the world is incredibly important. And that goes a long way, but it doesn't actually go that far when you're managing the logistics of a 24-hour day
Right.
where you come home and, I don't know about your folks, but we were used to like coming home, connecting, having dinner, and then getting back on our computers and working
Yeah.
more. And a lot of those margins have shrunk for us.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a constant navigation. And I would say, we laugh, although it's painful for me sometimes. John will still get from his friends or colleagues when he says, "Oh, I can't do that on Wednesday night because I've got the kids." They'll be like, "Oh, that's nice, you're babysitting," and
Oh.
he's like, "No, actually, I'm parenting. It's not called babysitting when it's your own kids." Whereas nobody's ever said to me, "You're babysitting," right?
Weird.
And I would say, it works both ways. I was unbelievably supported by my colleagues and my board in taking my maternity leave. The response for him was a little bit more like, "Oh, that's cute. Isn't that cute
Yeah.
that you're taking time off to be with your kids?" Which
Yeah.
is really infantilizing.
Yeah.
So he gets more credit when he's doing it on one level, but a little like more suspicion as
Right.
well. But my most significant learning, which is a little
Mhm.
bit controversial, but I'm going to share it with you guys anyway, is
Great.
that I have had to really check myself because I want to be equal partners in parenting with my husband, but we're also raised to believe I'm the mom and I know best, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I've had to like give up control in order to actually have that equal partnership. And I don't get to say, "No, do it my way," because I'm the
Right.
mom, right? Which
Right.
is super challenging.
Yeah.
And I would also say, love my husband. He's amazing. But our household is also very typical of we are really close to equal parenting, as close as you can be when you're breastfeeding.
Yeah.
But the housework still falls on me
Yeah.
disproportionately.
Yeah.
And we've had those conversations, and with that just shows that we're very, very typical American couples.
Mhm.
And we've had that conversation, and his response is, "I want to be an equal partner with you with housework. I just want you to care less about how clean the house is." So those are the kinds of conversations that happen. But one of the things that I find super encouraging is
Mhm.
that the younger generation of men, and by that I mean 30 and under, are actually saying that one of the things they're looking for when they're looking for jobs is
Mhm.
parental leave. And I think
Right.
when men start to advocate for things, they move faster. And
Yeah.
I say that about all the issues that we work on. We have a very, very robust Men for Choice program where men are getting involved in everything from parental leave to abortion access. And,
Yeah.
as I always say, when women get pregnant, there is another person involved, right? So there has to be room
Is
for
it? Yeah.
men in the conversation, and we're finding it's really changing the dynamics of the conversation because, like it or not, we still live in a
Mhm.
patriarchal society. So we need those partners in advocating for all of these basic fundamental rights because we know that the outcome is better for everyone.
Yeah. It's awesome. So it's an interesting sort of acknowledgement that getting men on board accelerates progress, whatever the issue might be. And so we're trying to, I think that's a really interesting and timely reference to everything that's happening with like the he for she movement from the UN to, talking about sustainable success in the workplace, which is really what we talk about when saying like, here's what it takes to craft a happy, healthy, and sustainable uh, career, and there's more than you involved. It takes a village kind of a thing. So
Right.
I have a question here that I think is really perfect from Brittany here in Washington, D.C. And all of our guests on Power Lunch are here because they've crafted careers with passion and purpose. And for some of us, especially millennials growing up in this work environment where, just find your passion has sort of been hammered home to us in an economy that makes that easier said than done. Can you share with us a little bit about how you got started and what, if anything, what advice do you have for women, particularly in our 20s and 30s, to set ourselves up to be in positions of power, so we can have those sort of purpose-driven careers, like being part of an organization like NARAL?
Yes. So I always acknowledge that, I graduated from college in the mid 90s and the economy was very different, and
Yeah,
the sense of anxiety was not as profound as it is for my friends in the millennial generation. And, I have family that lives here in DC that I talk to all the time about job security. So with that caveat,
sure.
and that caveat came with sort of a confidence that there were jobs out there for us, right? So we didn't
Right.
have to take the first job that came along. That said, if, I didn't start off saying I'm going to end up as the president of NARAL.
Right.
I started off saying I want to fundamentally make a difference in the world. I want to work for justice and equality. And as you noted, that's taken many, many different manifestations. But the thing for me was always twofold: staying true to that sentiment, but allowing it to take on different manifestations. And while I've always worked in the NGO sector, I have met so many people who are making change in corporations, in government. I think if we stick true to the ideal and what drives us, then the form follows function, right?
Right.
Like where you are, I couldn't do what I do if I didn't have similar advocates at businesses, similar advocates in government. It takes all of us working together. Second thing is trusting my instinct, right? And really saying, I've said no to jobs that I was actually scared to say no to, because I was like, what if that's the best I can do, right? But also knowing, like, having a job that I don't like or that doesn't make the best use of my skills is not going to get me where I want to go. But also recognizing that comes with a sacrifice, right? Like, I waited tables because I had an underpaying job in organizing that didn't mean I could pay my bills. So, like, come from an empowered place and say no, but also recognize you don't just get to say no, right? Like, you have to actually then accommodate that in your life, but follow your instinct. If something like NARAL was the furthest thing from my mind when they approached me, but I also was like, well, at least this will be an interesting conversation. So I had the conversation, and then I followed my instinct that it might be the right thing for me.
I love it.
And then the third thing is, don't be afraid to advocate and shape things for yourself. So when Move On came to me, they said, we want you to do this. And I thought about it, and I was like, well, I would like to do that, but I also want to do this as well. And negotiated from a place of good faith. And there was a lot of data about negotiating, particularly around salary and like flex time, that shows that women can be punished for it. And I want to acknowledge that. But at the same time, expand your idea of what you're negotiating around, right? Because a lot of times what we bring into organizations or companies that we work for is a fresh perspective and saying, I can do that. That's what you need. That's the core competency you need. But let me experiment with doing this as well. Because what I found is once you are viewed as a valuable participant in the organization that you're with, then that conversation around salary and time becomes so much easier, right? Because nobody wants to lose talent. They just don't. There's not talent out there to lose talent.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really great advice all around. I'm taking notes here feverishly because we do a write-up after this, and I'm definitely putting those down. I think we cover negotiation at Bossed Up Boot Camp. It's one of the modules at our weekend-long training program for women navigating career transition. And the first thing that always comes up for negotiation is that it feels intrinsically combative. And so if we come at it, like you're saying, with a broad perspective of shaping this into the role that we want it to be, what I like to think about is that if we're not being selfish by asking for what we need to show up fully at the workplace, right? If that means flex time, if that means, having time for your side hustle, whatever it looks like, if it frees you up, like you said, if it comes from a authentic place or from a good place to actually show up and deliver, then everybody's better off. It's just scary. Like, there's a lot of fear involved in knowing your worth, believing that you're worth it. That's part of shutting down the wrong option. Being able to say no requires a sense of worthiness, right? To even go there, so that you're not operating strictly from fear and from scarcity. I love that. Those are really good points. So we have a very long but awesome question and comment that sort of came in here about an article I wrote for LinkedIn in September, which happens to be like trending right now. Of course, not when I wrote it in September, but it's called Work-Life Balance is Not a Mommy Issue. And essentially what I did in that piece, and what we're being asked about here, is that the overwork culture, that 24-hour workday that you mentioned earlier, going home, having dinner with your significant other, and then hopping back on the computer, that sort of intrinsically, that being a new normal that we operate in, really hampers parents, first of all, but also in my sort of very anecdotal experiences with the women I work with at Bossed Up, seems to be leading to higher rates of burnout, especially amongst young women in the workplace. So those without children, without the quote unquote excuse to advocate for life, to advocate for having a life outside of our careers. And so I guess it's sort of an open-ended question here is the implication that those women who aren't going down that path should have to pick up the slack for those who are. It's sort of like setting us up for a new age mommy war, which nobody wants to have. But what are your thoughts on navigating what I call the burnout work culture, but it's really just this overwork culture that we operate in?
Oh, there are a lot of questions in that. So
yeah.
What I have found, and I hope that the millennial generation is a little bit different than the Gen X generation that I'm a part of, is that, all of this starts with owning your worth as someone separate from your parenting status. And that is, by the way, intrinsic to everything that I fight for. This idea that women are more than vessels for other life, whether you choose to do that or not.
Right.
We have more to contribute than that. And we really do have to own that because, this played out a couple ways for me. I was the classic case of, we had children later, so I'm 34 and I don't have kids. And so the way I was going to prove my worth in the workplace was to just pick that stuff up when people went on parental leave or whatever and expect kudos to come rolling in. Right? But what happens actually is people actually think that that's how you gain your own self-value, and therefore they're doing you a favor by piling more stuff on you. So I think it starts with owning that we are more valuable to ourselves and to the world at large in our organizations when, regardless of parenting status, we're taking the time off that we're due, and we're being, what I say is, efficient at work, right? We're saying, I am going to commit to doing this because this is a reasonable amount to do. And I make my staff come to me with this all the time. If I then go in the middle of the week and say, oh, but this is urgent, you need to do this, their job is to come back to me and say, okay, I can do that. You're the boss. You get to choose. But what is coming off my plate this week?
Bingo.
And I think that that's a really important thing for us to do. I mean, culturally, this is the big issue for this generation to define, right? When I was 33, I traveled all over the friggin' world, spending thousands of dollars to go to friends' weddings. There was no wedding for me on the horizon.
Right.
And I said, you know what? It's my 33rd birthday. None of you have had to travel for a wedding. I want to go away for a weekend, and I want you guys to come. And that was really, some people could and some people couldn't, right? People have different resources and they choose that all the time. But just to speak that and say, I am valuable even though I'm not asking you to come to a wedding was really transformative. And my being able to be proud to be out in the world and have self-worth other than my marital status or my parenting status. So there's a risk of what I'm saying in that what I don't want to say is that I'm blaming the victim, right? Like if we're setting boundaries and we're owning our worth and it's not being met, that is a problem.
Right.
And that needs to be either spoken through mediated conversation in the workplace, or you need to find another job because they're never going to respect you. But I do think that anytime we're having these conversations, it has to come from a place of internal power. So we have
Totally.
work to do to own that power ourselves, that we are valuable in and of ourselves, and anything else we choose to do, whether it's get married or have children or not, is just adjunct to that power. It is not where our power comes from.
Awesome. Love it. And I'm almost reminded of my days as a labor organizer, and sort of, we could talk all day about big macro, economics that are involved with the lack of workers' sort of rights and organizing in today's workplace, especially for information workers. It's like, what are you talking about, And so tapping into that power within first and foremost, and then B, getting the tools you need to turn that power into external leverage power is sort of what I am fascinated by and love. And sometimes,
have the conversation with other folks in your workplace, men and women.
Yes.
Because you're not alone, right? I mean, it goes to sort of being in labor, and the principle of collective bargaining, without even getting into the bargaining part, is just recognizing the common experience there.
Yes.
And that is a sense of collective power.
Awesome. I love it. And I just love that what is coming off my plate line. I think that's something for us all to take home and sort of say, okay, here's one actionable thing I can do. Next time, I'm being interrupted from my workflow in this age of distraction we sort of operate in, make sure to have that open dialogue around, yes, I can prioritize this, what's coming off the list. And I love the best advice I heard on that same thread was, going to your boss and saying, hey, can we talk about reshuffling my priorities? I want to make sure they're aligned with your priorities. Because that sort of phrasing makes it clear that you want to align your efficiency with the broader strategy. And sometimes we have to do a lot of managing up, right? Like sometimes asking that spurs that conversation, which can help you feel more effective and accomplished at work. Love it.
I will tell your listeners that the art of managing up, under talked about, is what will allow you to achieve in life. I promise you. And I actively encourage my staff to manage up. I practice a lot of managing up of my board. We don't talk about it. We don't teach it as a skill the way we teach managing your team that you're a supervisor of. But it is, I love the way you put it, because it truly is an organizer's job, right? Like I have an idea that I want to do. I suspect it might be disruptive to my board's way of thinking. It's an organizing project, right? It's not, I want to be right and they're wrong and they're old and they don't know how to think about the work that we do in a new lens. It's about educating and organizing. And I don't care if at the end of it they think it's their idea, right? I mean, the goal is to get the work done.
Yeah, I like to always think of it as bringing resources to need. Like here's the organizing project I want to persuade people to buy into. Like, how do I actually bring the resources to this to make that possible, to solve that problem? And just that basic principle can be applied for all persuasive communication, even if it's negotiating your own damn raise, whatever it looks like. How has, just to sort of go on that thread, how has managing up been a part of what got you here? Because I think about the people I've worked with or I've had work for me, and I think the people who manage up effectively strike me as the most effective, pleasant, wonderful, ass-kicking people, frankly. And so I love what you said about that being a skill to develop to advance your career. Has that been a part of your, secret to success?
Absolutely. Managing up is almost another word for building trust, right? Because I want to be surrounded by people in my executive position that I trust. And that means a lot of different things to me. It means I trust their strategic insight, right? Which means they're bringing me projects and they're getting me to buy onto them because I want them out in the world doing that with funders, with coalition partners. But it also means I trust them to tell me when I'm putting forward something that doesn't make sense to them, right? And so, I think that I learned that when I think the first time I learned that was when I had a job that I was like, I'm done. Either something has to change or I'm out of here. Yeah. So I was like, well, let me experiment a little bit since I have nothing to lose, right? Since I'm okay walking away from this job, I have nothing to lose. So I'm going to experiment a little bit with not being afraid and bringing my ideas, but as you said, in a way that's like, let me just test this with you. What are you seeing here that I'm not seeing? Because this doesn't totally make sense to me. And the reception was so much warmer than I anticipated, or me like sort of silently sulking, which I have been known to do.
Yeah, I call it implosion. I implode.
Right.
I don't explode, right? Yeah.
You know, and I think there's when you read negotiation strategy, there's an idea of like, I can be right or I can be successful. And that's a little bit binary because you can't actually be both, but the frame is what's important there. Do you care more about people seeing you as right all the time, or do you actually care about your ideas having a life of their own and moving forward? And then, by the way, people will remember that they're your ideas. And I will say, we practice this in our marriage a lot. I can be right or I can be married, which doesn't mean I'm always like, no, honey, you're right. But if I'm entering a conversation to prove that I'm right, then it usually goes badly, right? If I enter a conversation to say, I think this is the best thing for us to do together, it goes a lot better.
It sort of reminds me of the whole sort of bucket of topics around assertive communication, because, you know, with assertive communication being a skill in your toolbox, like the ability to sort of advocate for your rights and wants and needs while being mindful of the rights and wants and needs of others, right? That's being assertive. That means you have to sort of pick your battles sometimes. And I feel like that's true at home as well as at work. And what you mentioned, the reception being so much warmer than you would have anticipated, despite it being really scary. There's actual research that points to the fact that when we women are assertive in the workplace, even though we run the risk of being seen more as bossy than as, you know, a man doing the same exact things, because we're sort of countering the traditional stereotypes about what makes a good, obedient sort of woman. When we are choosing to be assertive strategically and go to the mat for something we really believe in, it's also shown that that is linked to having a higher rating of executive presence. So like being a little disagreeable is part of what being a leader looks like, you know, or just being the person to say no, or to put their foot down, or to, you know, say, I want to push back on that strategically. Here's why, you know, here's my intent behind that communication, is so important, even though it feels so scary because we're not socialized as women to be assertive.
I think that's absolutely right. And, you know, I think about some of the biggest mistakes I've made in my career. And one of them came at a job that I was at where, you know, I spent a lot of time being second in command to men.
Yeah.
And when the top position came open, it was between me and another man who would be the natural successors for the leaving executive, for the departing executive. And there was a sense of like, he had been around longer, he sort of had the institutional wisdom, and I was encouraged to sort of think about applying, but know that he had the advantage going in. And I just accepted that. And I said, okay, if one thing I said, which by the way, you guys should never say, is if I really am in it for the work and not the power, then I don't care about position, right? Don't do that, right? Don't do that. If you're in it for the work and you think the position allows you to more fully live the work and exhibit the skills that you bring to bear, that is synonymous with actually being passionate and caring about the outcome. It is not at odds with it, because you don't hear men being like, oh, if my intentions are pure, I won't ask for a promotion. Right. So that was one thing. But also, I unilaterally withdrew. I said, he's going to get it anyway. He's probably more qualified. I'm just going to continue with my number 2 position. I've always been comfortable there. That's totally fine. And you know what? It was never the same after that. I was resentful. I didn't enjoy my work anymore, and I ended up leaving. And so that wasn't a good outcome for anyone, right? Like the organization didn't want to lose me. And by the time that I tendered my resignation, I was so far gone because I was so resentful that there was nothing butt out for me. Whereas if I had just been true to myself and said, I hear that, I hear he has different qualifications, I just want to have the conversation, and maybe at the end I won't get the job, but I'll feel better about the process because I'm having the conversation, it could have been a different outcome.
Yeah, that's so interesting. So on that sort of just branching out on that thought of mistakes we make at work, not to put you on the hot seat, but what has been like the biggest challenge that you faced along the way, or what has been in your mind like your biggest learn through, trial and error type lesson learned along the way? I always find this question to be pretty helpful, and we all make mistakes because it's part of learning, but I think it's fascinating what different people identify as challenges in this sort of career path of yours.
I'll say a couple different things. One is what I just said, which is just don't unilaterally withdraw, right?
Right.
That whether you're talking about a promotion at work where you're competing against someone else, or whether you're actually talking about, like I did with NARAL, like I never thought about that. That doesn't make sense. I shouldn't be in the running for that. The conversation is so educational for you as an individual, and also for the people that you're talking to, whether they're excited about the conversation or not, it is educational. Don't unilaterally withdraw. I will say, and I've talked about this publicly before, my biggest challenge in taking the position that I have now is that I had always sort of seen myself as the gal at the guy's table.
Yeah.
Right? That the work that I did in the environmental movement, in corporate advocacy at Move On, because at the time it was all men and so tech-based, and that was man's world. It still is, but it's not as bad as it used to be.
Right.
I took a particular pride in being the gal who could be at the guy's table.
Right.
And I didn't recognize that, how deep that was in myself, until I was asked to take over a women's organization. And I had a lot of internalized misogyny that was like, well, does that make me lesser than being an executive at a non-gender based organization, right? And what I had to recognize was that we have no hope of our issues and our place in the world being treated as equal if we aren't actually treating them as equal.
Totally.
And that in taking the position at NARAL, one of the first things I did was open the door and invite men into the conversation, as we talked about before.
Right.
Because there's no way that we're going to be perceived as anything other than a marginal organization, despite the fact that we're 52% of the population, if we're not having a whole swath of, people saying these are important issues. And so it was a really big challenge for me to say, I can feel as successful and as good being seen as a gender advocate, a women's advocate, versus just a general advocate. And that, there felt like something selfish about advocating for parental leave when I was pregnant. And I had friends say, well, no, the entire history of organizing and social change is people advocating for their own benefit in society because they're not being offered it. So why do we as women feel like there's something wrong with that? And so, that was a really big challenge. But I think that other, there are some very specific things that I would point to around, I have a fake it till you make it kind of thing, which isn't like, and things that you don't, and dig in. It's actually recognize what you know and recognize what you don't know, and seek to arm yourself with the skills and education you need to actually know what you don't know that's pertinent to your job and your life. But at the same time, nobody really, we're making this up as we go along. So don't assume anyone else knows better than you do. Right?
I'm so glad you said that. Yeah. Because that's half of the point here of having badass women like you on, is to say, to us in our 20s and 30s, just remind us that these are new frontiers for everyone, or it wouldn't be a growth move if you weren't figuring it out as you go. Forgive me, I have a barking dog companion in the office today. Hold on one second. Griffin, I'm dog sitting for a friend, so forgive me, in her office as well. But yeah, so I think it's about time we wrap things up. Ilyse, is there anything else that you wanted to add to the conversation? Or if anyone has a last question, feel free to throw it in there now.
I mean, I would offer two things for your folks.
Yes.
One is a question that I saw in the scroll that didn't get asked, which was about the recent Supreme Court announcement that they're going to take up both a birth control and an abortion case. You know, I think one of the things that we all have to recognize as women in terms of the conversation we're having around advocating for our own self-interest is that we are actually facing a society that is the last dying gasp of hardline patriarchy. So the kinds of very, very fundamental tools that we know we need, like contraception and abortion and parental leave, to succeed, not because we're selfish, but because that's what allows society to thrive, really, really are up for grabs right now.
Yes.
And we really actually have to recognize the Supreme Court case on abortion will define abortion access for generations to come.
Awesome.
And that we have to recognize that there is no such thing as economic security, professional advancement without the fundamental right to decide what happens with our bodies and our lives. And now is the time to kind of throw down around it, and that people's sort of nervousness, we talk a lot about nervousness on this, about advocating for ourselves, comes from a very old idea that there is something to be ashamed of or fear in empowered women, and specifically sexually empowered women.
Right.
And now is the time to throw that off and get in the fight. And part of that, and this is what I'll leave you with, is wherever you work, whatever you're doing, make part of your negotiations asking what your employer benefits are with regard to contraception, abortion, and parental leave. Because the sooner that the marketplace understands that we expect support through our entire reproductive life cycle, the sooner we're going to be assured of that and be able to accede to the leadership positions that we need to be in so that our country excels.
I love it. Thank you so much for hitting on that. And thank you to Joanne for asking the question. I totally missed that earlier. What can we do to learn more about NARAL, Ilyse? How can we get more involved?
You can go to NARAL.org, where we do talk about the Supreme Court cases. We talk about what's coming up. We're planning big, big days of action in the winter and spring so that the court understands that we expect our rights. And we're not going back. So get involved and stay at Ilyse H on Twitter. And I look forward to seeing you out there.
Awesome. We'll continue to tweet and continue this conversation with us on Twitter, on Instagram. I'll be blogging about this later today, and we'll have this up on YouTube pretty soon. So thank you so much, Ilyse. As Alicia here in the comments says, Ilyse, you rock. I think that sums it up perfectly. Thank you so much for
the whole WhatsApp community. So thank you for having me on.
Thank you. All right. We will be keeping in touch and continue this chatter online. Thanks so much for spending